So good evening and welcome to Holocaust Museum Houston at the Lester and Sue Smith campus. So I'm Amy Frake. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Education here at the museum. And we'd like to thank you for joining us for tonight's program, which is brought to you by our presenting sponsor, Memorial Hermann, on the Maddie and Ken Cadiz stage. So tonight's presentation is the Gerald S. Kaplan Endowed Lecture, which is part of the Max M. Kaplan Summer Institute. Dedicated educators from across the greater Houston region and beyond are here for 3 days of intensive study about how to bring the lessons of the Holocaust to their students. At this time, I would like to ask that the Kaplan Summer Institute participants raise their hands to be recognized for their dedication to Holocaust education. So the Max M. Kaplan Summer Institute and the Gerald S. Kaplan Endowed Lecture are made possible through the generous support of the Max M. Kaplan Teacher Education Endowment Fund and the Gerald S. Kaplan Endowment Fund. So to represent the Kaplan family, I would like to invite Peter Williamson to the stage to welcome you.
When Max passed away in 1991, his siblings, who were Gerald, Irvin, and my mother, Sophie Ann, along with nieces and nephews, came together to find a way to honor his memory. We believed that the best tribute would be to bring educators together to explore the vital lessons of the Holocaust, which we all kind of grew up with. Our hope was, and continues to be, that by empowering teachers, we can make the world a better place. We believe that teachers have the greatest reach and lasting impact on students and on society. Years later, when Gerald passed away, the family felt that it was only right to permanently leak the legacies of the two brothers. You know, they talked every day. That desire led to the creation of this particular lecture series, which brought us here tonight. Today, the Institute has grown more than we imagined. It's become this 3-day program, and we've had more than 1,000 educators. I know Max and Gerald would have been very happy if they could have seen you here tonight. And this is how we keep their legacies alive. We keep them alive. Now, more than ever, we're witnessing efforts to deny the Holocaust and rewrite history. It's vital to preserve the truth. Books are being removed from libraries, and it's vital that before these essential curricula are erased, that we recognize the responsibility that upholding the values of our community rests with you. That's why we think that it's a big, a big deal that we have teachers from the South, from the Midwest, from the Northeast here tonight. Individual acts like my own man's, like my grandparents', they're one thing. But if you really want to have, and we do, an influence to have systemic change, you have to organize the teachers. They're the real heroes that can keep all of this from ever happening again. We thank you. On behalf of the family, we warmly welcome Dr. Rich this evening, and we thank the Holocaust Museum of Houston for its tireless work. Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, Peter. So I now have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Dave Rich, MBE. Dr. Rich has worked for almost 30 years for the Community Security Trust, a Jewish charity that protects the UK Jewish community. He is the author of Everyday Hate, How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World and How You Can Change It. We're going to have copies for sale after the program, and Dr. Rich has generously agreed to sign those copies as well. Dr. Rich writes regularly about anti-Semitism and extremism for UK and international media and does academic work about hate crimes, conspiracy theories, the abuse of Holocaust memory, anti-Israel boycotts, campus anti-Semitism, and the campaign for Soviet Jewry. He is a research fellow at the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Contemporary Antisemitism. Dr. Rich was recently honored with a member of the Order of the British Empire for his services in tackling anti-Semitism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dave Rich.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It is a real treat to be here tonight, and not only because it's my first ever visit to Texas, which is personally a bit of a thrill, but because I think the work that's done here is really important and really valuable. We're going to be talking this evening about anti-Semitism, which by definition is quite a dark and troubling subject. And we look for shafts of light, we look for reasons for optimism, and we always come back to education as the main grounds for optimism. And yet we live in a time, as we're going to be talking about, when anti-Semitism is getting worse. And I think, as well as just looking to education as an answer, it's really important that people are teaching the right things in the right way. And in that respect, I think the work that's done here, educating the educators about how to teach about the Shoah and about anti-Semitism, is really vital and really valuable and commendable. And so it's just a real honor and a real privilege for me to be able to be part of that in some way. I wish there were more centers around the world doing the work that you're doing here. But I'm going to start not by talking about what's happening in the United States or in my own country of the United Kingdom, but in Australia, and more specifically in Melbourne, on a Friday evening just 2 weeks ago, where three things of significance happened on the same night. The first was at the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation, where a man tried to burn the synagogue building down with around 20 people, including children, inside having a Shabbat evening dinner. Fortunately, he only managed to burn the front door because the synagogue had followed its security procedures and the front door was locked shut, potentially saving the lives of those inside. Now, at the same time, in another part of the city, a mob broke away from a pro-Palestinian demonstration and stormed a nearby Israeli-owned restaurant, shouting, "Death to the IDF." Windows were smashed, people were threatened before the police turned up and made arrests. And in yet another part of town, 3 cars outside a facility linked to Israel were set alight and had graffiti daubed on them. Now, this all happened in one night, in one city, in a far corner of the world, a city with a reputation for being very open and welcoming and liberal and progressive. And nobody even knows if these 3 incidents were linked or if the perpetrators just happened by coincidence to choose the same night to burn things down and smash things up, all in the name of hating Israel or hating Jews. The arson at the East Melbourne synagogue was the 10th time in the past 12 months that an Australian Jewish premises has been firebombed. The mob attack at the Israeli restaurant used a slogan, "Death to the IDF," that nobody had heard of until last month when a performer used it on stage at the Glastonbury Music Festival in England. And I'll come back to that later. But that slogan spread from southwest England to southeast Australia in the blink of an eye, because this is a global movement. And people asked, is it anti-Semitic to storm an Israeli-owned restaurant? Or is it just anti-Israel? And does that even make any difference to the terrified diners inside, who may or may not themselves have been Jewish or Israeli? And this kind of thing has become so commonplace now, so frequent, that the third part of this triad, the torching of cars outside an Israeli-linked building in another part of the same city on the same night, barely made the news. My Jewish friends in Australia tell me they used to think of their home as an idyll, as a safe haven from the tides of conflict and extremism that wash over the rest of the world. Well, they don't think that now. I don't think any of us have that luxury anymore, wherever we live. In the 21 months since October the 7th, 2023, I've lost count of the number of stories I've heard from friends, family, my own children, and other people across the Jewish community of things that have happened to them or people they know. Stories of friends' children being threatened on the school bus or at their university campus, of hearing people saying things about Jews that they would never have said before. And what we in the British Jewish community have experienced since October the 7th, American Jews have also experienced here in the US, as have our fellow Jews across the globe, in France and South Africa, in Canada and Chile, and beyond. And in case anyone is wondering whether this is merely a question of hate speech, of people saying offensive or hurtful things about Jews, think again. It's not only that. This is about vicious hate leading to violent action. Here in the United States, Karen Diamond, 82 years old, murdered in Boulder, Colorado, while taking part in a march to support Israeli hostages. There was attacked by a man throwing Molotov cocktails and shouting, "Free Palestine." 11 other people were injured, some badly. The attacker later told police he wanted to kill all Zionist people. And that appalling crime came shortly after Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, both Israeli embassy workers, one American and one Israeli, were shot dead when leaving a Jewish community event at the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., by a man crying, "Free, free Palestine," and there is only one solution, intifada, revolution. Familiar slogans. Further afield, Rabbi Tzvi Kogan was murdered in the UAE in November last year in a terrorist plot ultimately attributed to Iran. This carried an extra layer of tragedy because Rabbi Kogan's widow, Rivki, a US citizen, is the niece of another rabbi, Gavriel Noach Holzberg, who himself was murdered by Islamist terrorists in Mumbai in 2008 in the attack on the Chabad house there. It goes around. In fact, between October 2023 and early June of this year, there have been more than 100 terrorist attacks, disrupted terror plots, and incidents of extreme violence directed against Jewish, Israeli, and other targets worldwide, not including those in Israel, but taking place in over 20 countries and in multiple continents. This includes bombings, shootings, and stabbings, sometimes in combination. If I tell you that since October 7th, synagogues have been firebombed in Australia, Germany, Tunisia, Russia, France, Canada, Armenia, 5 different continents, but the same hateful act. Now, prejudice can be found anywhere, but it is hard to think of any other type of bigotry that operates in sync across so many parts of the world at the same time as part of a single phenomenon. And then there is the day-to-day hate crime, the less eye-catching but no less debilitating daily grind of anti-Semitic shouts and comments, anti-Jewish graffiti, social media posts, advocating for violence and spreading hatred. It's come to the point now where most Jews, wherever in the world they live, know that there is a particular risk, especially if you wear a kippah or a Star of David necklace or a school uniform or something else that marks you out as visibly Jewish. There is a risk that this day will be the day when some random stranger tells you that you are not the good person you thought you are, the ordinary member of society, but in fact you are a racist, genocidal baby killer just because you're a Jew. In a way, being an individual victim of anti-Semitism has always been a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, there are a lot more wrong places and wrong times than there used to be. In the UK, in the last 2 years, we've seen record levels of harassment, abuse, threats, and assaults, and other anti-Jewish hate crimes. In fact, according to official police figures, in the UK, a Jewish person is 12 times more likely to be a victim of a religion-based hate crime than a member of any other faith community. Here in the United States, although Jews only make up around 2% of the US population, in 2023, 15% of all hate crimes of any type were against Jewish victims, and 68% of all religious-based hate crimes were. Now, Jewish life still goes on, of course. Our communities are thriving in many ways, and I think many of us have found an inner resilience that we never previously needed. But it's become increasingly difficult to avoid anti-Semitism, either directly or indirectly. Even if you haven't personally been a victim of it, you can smell it in the air. You know it's around. It has become part of our world in a way that was not the case before October 7th. Now, there is a risk that this becomes normalized, that we just shrug and live with it and get on. And to a certain extent, that's what resilience means. But even if we find a way to get through it or get on, we should never accept it. We should always ask the question, why? Why does this happen? Now, there is a simple answer, of course, which is that this enduring wave of anti-Jewish hatred around the world is a response to Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. There's a correlation, and it's very familiar, this pattern, in which wars involving Israel are brought to the doorsteps of diaspora Jews. So much so that we've come to expect it. Every time Israel is at war, especially if that war is fought in Gaza, Jews around the world get attacked and abused and threatened by strangers, or even by classmates and colleagues, on the street and online. And even if we are not personally, physically threatened or verbally harassed in this way, a lot of Jewish people find themselves gradually and silently excluded and demonized and squeezed out, as if, because we're Jewish and therefore in one way or another connected to Israel, we are morally deficient in some people's eyes, a harmful force in society to be shunned. Now, I said this is familiar, but it isn't normal, because this doesn't happen for any other overseas conflict. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, there was no wave of anti-Russian hate crimes in Western countries. It just didn't happen. When the war in Yemen cost hundreds of thousands of lives, a war fought on one side by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of whom are Western allies, using American and British arms, it did not cause a tsunami of anti-Arab hatred in Western societies, nor did it fuel a protest movement that filled our city centres and our university campuses, as the anti-Israel one does. The dynamic of emotion and behaviour related to Israel's wars that we see within our own countries is only triggered by Israel and by no other foreign country or conflict. So again, we have to ask the question, why does this happen? Simply saying it is because of conflicts in Israel and Palestine is not enough of an answer. It can't on its own explain what's going on. But I think if we dig a little deeper, we can find an explanation. Now, we need to start on October 7th itself, because the huge rise in anti-Semitism that we are experiencing across the world now began as soon as news spread that thousands of Hamas fighters had invaded Israel, killing large numbers of civilians and taking many others hostage. Now, it took a few days for the scale of that atrocity to become clear, that 1,200 people have been killed, that over 250 hostages have been taken into Gaza, some of whom are still there today, almost 2 years later. It took time for the brutality of the attack to become known. Civilians murdered in cold blood, whole families burnt alive in their homes, of the sexual violence and torture that took place that day. But while the full details dripped out over the course of days, the anti-Jewish reaction began immediately. In the UK, the very first anti-Semitic incident directly linked to the conflict occurred at lunchtime on October 7th, just after 12 o'clock, when a car drove past a synagogue on the outskirts of Greater London, and the passenger in this car, waving a big Palestinian flag, shook his fist at the Jewish congregants leaving the premises. It was the end of Shabbat morning prayers, and this was an Orthodox synagogue. The people on the receiving end of this particular piece of abuse if they were observant Orthodox Jews who didn't use their phones on Shabbat, may not have even known that at that time Hamas terrorists were still killing their fellow Jews in Israel. But the people in that car knew. They knew what was happening. And their response to the scenes of murder and terror in Israel was not horror and sympathy, but joy and celebration. And they were not the only ones. The week with the highest ever number of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK reported to the Community Security Trust was the week immediately following the October 7th attack. Not the week after the Israeli army launched its ground invasion of Gaza, not the weeks following news reports about bombings of hospitals and schools, not even as more time passed and the death toll in Gaza rose and the stories of the dire humanitarian situation became common. No, the highest numbers of anti-Semitic attacks in the UK and in several other countries came right at the start, when it looked like Hamas was winning and Israel was losing. And that's an important point. And these incidents were coming at higher numbers than any previous wave of anti-Semitic hate crime triggered by war in Gaza. It was as if the record number of Israelis killed by Hamas led directly to record levels of anti-Jewish hate around the world. Now, this wave of anti-Semitism has been sustained now for over a year and a half. Levels of anti-Jewish hate crimes remain higher than they were before the 7th of October attacks and show no sign of going back to what we used to think of as normal. It has continued through the past 21 months as the death toll in Gaza and the conflicts in the Middle East has continued to fill our TV screens and our social media feeds. And in these circumstances, it's easy to forget how it began, but it's important not to make that mistake. Because right at the start, the spark that began this global firestorm was not images of dead Palestinians, but pictures of dead Jews. And the anti-Jewish reaction it triggered began not as one of anger, but as celebration and excitement about what happened that day. And what was also not normal, what doesn't happen for any other overseas conflict, and I think really shocked Jewish communities around the world more than anything, were the protests and demonstrations held across Western countries in those early days, not against what Hamas had done, but in their support. In London, thousands of people demonstrated outside the Israeli embassy on October the 9th in a gathering that had the mood of a party. People let off flares, they banged drums, they danced their way into central London. In the United States, National Students for Justice in Palestine called the 7th of October massacre, quote, a historic win for the Palestinian resistance. In Sydney, a demonstration outside the famous Sydney Opera House was marked by shouts of F the Jews. Now, one thing those protesters didn't do back in those days when it was Jews who were mourning our dead was call for a ceasefire. As one speaker at the London rally outside the embassy on the 9th of October put it, in terms repeated at similar demonstrations here in the US and across the world, and this is a quote, the Palestinians will continue to enact their God-given right to resist oppression and occupation by any means necessary. And we all knew what that meant 2 days after October 7th. There was no sign that anyone in this movement thought that Hamas had gone too far, or that Israeli civilians living within the borders of sovereign Israel had the right not to be murdered. This was an immediate, instinctive, and revealing response, and it came literally while Hamas was still killing, raping, and kidnapping Israelis. In the UK, this is astonishing. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the main organization that organizes these protests, notified the police at 12:50 p.m. on October the 7th that they planned to hold a demonstration in response to Hamas's attack that morning. Lunchtime on October the 7th, it is not too much of a stretch to say that the UK Palestine Solidarity Campaign mobilized more quickly that day than even the IDF did. Now, I know that since then, as the situation in Gaza has got so much worse, many of the people who go on these protests are motivated by more honorable, more humanitarian concerns for the situation of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. But the people who went out on the streets to demonstrate on that weekend 7th, 8th, 9th of October 2023, did not have that excuse. Now, putting all that together, it has led to the phenomenon of what has come to be called the 8th of October Jews. People who had not previously felt strongly connected to their Jewish identity or to the wider Jewish community, or felt particularly attached to Israel, but whose emotional engagement with all of those things was switched on by the realization that they live amongst and alongside some people who would happily cheer the death of their fellow Jews, and who knows, perhaps would cheer our death too. I wrote at the time that if the Hamas attack on Israel that day revived collective historic Jewish memories of the pogroms, then those demonstrators who went out onto the streets of New York and London and Sydney on October the 8th to support Hamas in the name of resistance were the 21st century equivalents of the villagers who stood to the side laughing and cheering while our great-grandparents' shtetls were burnt down. And it was a shocking discovery for many of us, I think. It has led to a sense of isolation, a realization amongst a lot of Jews that our status and our rights as Jews in our own countries are not guaranteed, but might be conditional and contingent. If not our formal legal rights, then our informal social standing. That our world may not be so different from the world of our ancestors after all. And this sense has taken form over the past 21 months, not just because of the visible violent actions that I've described, but in more insidious, less overt ways. There are the Jewish performers who suddenly find they can't get bookings or whose shows are cancelled by promoters. Last year, the American Jewish reggae star Matisyahu had concerts cancelled in 3 different states, ostensibly due to security concerns, but in reality, because he's Jewish. And specifically, he's a Jew who refuses to denounce Israel. And that is enough for him to be cancelled and boycotted. For some staff at venues hosting him to refuse to work, or for those venues to be bombarded with complaints and protests, to the point that Jewish performers simply don't get booked anymore because it isn't worth the trouble. In the UK, we've seen the same thing. Bands with Israeli performers or Israeli band members having their shows cancelled, not for anything they've said or done, but simply because they are Israeli or they work with Israelis. The chief executive of the UK's Jewish Film Festival warned last October of what he called the erasure of British Jewish culture from national cultural life, because arts bodies, large and small, across the UK were routinely excluding Jews from performance venues and funding grants. Too controversial, I think, was the point. Too much risk. Even if those artists had never said or done anything about Israel themselves, it would just attract too much trouble. Whether it's in the arts, at school, or in the workplace, anti-Semitism is no longer simply an issue of criminality or extremism. It has acquired a presence across civil society. In the UK, we've even seen it in hospitals. There was one case of a Jewish patient who left his hospital bed to go to the bathroom, only to return to find that somebody, presumably hospital staff, had stuck Free Palestine stickers all over the headboard of his bed. He just walked out of the hospital and didn't get his treatment. It all amounts to a squeezing out, an intangible but definite sense that Jews are not welcomed amongst what sociologist David Hirsch has called the community of the good, the right-thinking, progressive, anti-racist sensibilities that are supposed to embrace and protect all minorities. Added up, it has a chilling effect on Jewish identity. For years now, we've been told that the best, most inclusive workplaces are those that encourage staff to bring your whole self to work. I think for a lot of Jewish employees in a lot of workplaces, the lesson of the past 21 months has been leave your Jewish self at home. Now again, why does this happen? There is plenty of prejudice all round. Of course there is. Jews are not alone in that respect. Racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, misogyny still blight our societies, but nothing else brings this particular combination of terrorism, hate crimes, mass protests, and social and professional shunning, all triggered by reactions to an overseas conflict thousands of miles away and driven by people and movements who want to bring that conflict to our towns and cities. That combination is unique. And it is a reminder there is something qualitatively different about the way that some people relate to Israel and to Jews. Not just that it triggers a greater response, but a fundamentally different type of behavior. More emotional, more visceral, more personal, and ultimately more discriminatory and more threatening. Now, of course, much of this is focused on Israel, or is expressed and delivered through the framing of anti-Israel protests and discourse. And it's important to explain what I mean at this point, because there is a lot of confusion over what is or isn't legitimate protest and commentary, over what is anti-Israel and what is anti-Semitic. And different people will have different views about where the line falls between those different things. But I'll tell you where I think it should be. Firstly, it's obvious, but it still needs saying, I think, that Israel is a state with a government and a military that ought to be subject to the same scrutiny and critique as any other. More than that, it is a state that aspires to uphold the standards of liberal democracy and international law, and Jewish values too, and it should be held to those standards. Israel's Declaration of Independence states in clear terms that the state of Israel, I'm quoting, will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. It's an admirable statement. And there's nothing anti-Semitic, I think, about pointing out when Israel falls short of that promise. And it will fall short at times because it is a state like any other, human, flawed, complex, and facing multiple, at times seemingly impossible challenges that any government would struggle to navigate at the best of times. Clearly, there is a lot of bloodshed and destruction and a lot of suffering in the Middle East, and people are entitled to have very strong feelings about what the various protagonists in that conflict, including Israel, are doing. And there's nothing wrong with expressing those feelings within the bounds of ordinary political discourse and protest. And I would also say, all governments sometimes face criticism that is untrue or unfair. The American government does, the British government does, the Israeli government does, and it happens whoever is in office, whichever party or president is in power, and whichever direction the criticism comes from. And again, that in itself is not proof of prejudice, it's just politics. But what is different, and what is, in my view, fundamentally anti-Semitic, is the notion that there is something uniquely illegitimate and immoral about Israel's very existence, and that the only moral position to take is that Israel should never have been created and should no longer exist. It's found in the anti-Semitic idea that the state of Israel and its people have a uniquely criminal character, and therefore anything Israel does must have evil intent. You can see it, you can spot this, the way of thinking, in the people who can never acknowledge that anything Israel does to defend itself can ever be justified or understandable, or just an ordinary human response that any government or state might do. Rather, you see it in this idea that Israel's actions must always be wrong, and not just wrong, but done for sinister motives. That anything Israel does is a reflection of this supposed inhumanity that characterizes, in this way of thinking, not just Israel's founding and its day-to-day policies, but its innermost nature. And that the only answer to this problem is to get rid of Israel entirely. Now this is an obviously racist supposition about an entire nation, and it would be racist whichever nation it was said about. But it's only ever said about Israel. It carries with it the implication that Jewish national identity is itself uniquely malign. It suggests, and sometimes this is stated explicitly, that it is racist simply to believe that the Jews are a people who, in a world of nation states have the same right to national self-determination in their own sovereign state as any other people. In other words, the idea that Zionism is fundamentally, intrinsically racist. In my view, that is in itself an anti-Semitic idea. There's nothing exceptional about the idea that the Jews are a people with the same right to a home as any other. And that basic principle leaves plenty of room for debate about the constitution, the borders, the citizenship, the policies of the State of Israel. But nowadays, the word Zionism is more likely to be used as an insult, as a synonym for racism, for apartheid, colonialism, and even for Nazism. In some circles, there's nothing worse you can call someone than to call them a Zionist. It's even reached the stage where Zionism, the movement of Jewish national redemption that restored the Jewish people after the Shoah, is routinely described not as a response to Nazism and racism, but as a repeat of it. It's this defamatory demonization of Zionism in Israel, of Jewish collective identity and its realization in the modern state of Israel, where hostility to Israel transcends ordinary politics and enters the realm of hateful bigotry. Rarely do you see an anti-Israel protest nowadays without chants like, "We don't want two states, we want Palestine 48." With 48 being a reference, of course, to 1948, the year of Israel's birth, which Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. And for Palestinians, it was indeed a catastrophe, but it's important to remember the history of what happened at that time. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state formed at the same time as a Jewish state. That was the will of the international community expressed through a vote of the United Nations in November 1947 to partition the land. And that choice for partition was accepted by the Zionist movement. But instead of peaceful partition, there was war. And at the end of that war, most of the land that was supposed to become Palestine was occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan and Egypt. That was the West Bank and Gaza. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were left as refugees as a result. But the dream of those days, of the Arab side in that war, to destroy the new Jewish state at birth has never disappeared. And since October 7th, it has returned to center stage once again via the slogans and the placards of the protest movement that has occupied our streets and our campuses so often over the past 21 months. In fact, you could go so far as to say that the driving force that gives this movement its emotional weight and energy is this fantasy that Israel can be eliminated entirely, wiped from history as a way of purifying the world and opening the door to a new and, in their eyes, more moral future for humanity. Now, like I said, criticism of Israeli policies and actions is normal politics, but calling for Israel to be eradicated is not criticism, because there's nothing Israel can say or do in response to that particular demand other than simply to disappear. Now, when Hamas leaders state in their official policy documents and in their speeches and interviews that they intend to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, this is what they mean, and that is the phrase they use to mean it. It's the idea that the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea will be cleansed of the impurity of Israel. It's an idea that is plain in the articles and open letters by tenured academics calling the kibbutzim that were devastated by Hamas on October 7th illegal Israeli settlements, as if they have no more legitimacy than the wildest of hilltop cabins in the West Bank. It's implied in every social media post that talks about 77 years of settler colonialism rather than 58 years of occupation. And that's a transition in the rhetoric that we should pay attention to. Now, as I say, I know that many of the people who go on anti-Israel protests are there for honorable reasons. They see suffering and devastation in Gaza, and they want it to stop. But what about the leaders of those protests? What about the organizers of those demonstrations on the 8th of October? The ones who still to this day put out statements supporting armed resistance, denying the sexual violence of 7th of October, and declaring Israel to be illegitimate. They are the weather makers of this movement. They are the ones who set its direction, its tone, its language and goals, and they are driven by an eliminationist urge to see the world's only Jewish state destroyed and dismantled, erased entirely from history. And in pursuing that goal, whether they are aware of it or not, they are entirely, perfectly aligned with the movements in the Middle East who are leading the campaign against Israel on the ground in the place where the action really matters. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and behind them, the Islamic Republic of Iran, all of whom are committed to Israel's destruction and express that commitment and that desire using much the same language as the protesters here. The same talk of from the river to the sea, the lauding of resistance, the glorifying of martyrs, and the claim that Zionism is nothing short than a modern reincarnation of Nazism. The protesters on American or British streets and campuses marching behind these slogans may not think of themselves as the Western support movement for the Islamist campaign to destroy Israel, but in practical terms, that is the position they find themselves in. Now again, we must pause and acknowledge how unusual this is. There are many conflicts and situations of enduring and unbearable suffering around the world. There are credible allegations of genocide in Sudan and in China, to name but two examples. We can point to the death toll in the civil wars in Syria and Yemen, or the ongoing war in Ukraine, where appalling abuses have occurred. But in none of these cases, not one, do campaigners in the West argue that the solution to the conflict is simply to make one of the states involved disappear, to dismantle and eradicate an entire nation state against the will of its own people. Nobody argues that the answer to the war in Ukraine is to get rid of Russia. Nobody says the way to end alleged genocide in China is to eradicate China. But where Israel is concerned, the response of many of the activists in the West who lead and organize the protest movement against Israel is to argue that Israel should never have been created and that the only just outcome is for its creation to be reversed 77 years later, so that Israel is removed from the map and replaced in its entirety by Palestine. It's just not normal. Now, this fantasy that Israel can be destroyed is the vector through which centuries of ancient anti-Jewish prejudice is laundered and repackaged, and it is the fuel that then, in a kind of feedback loop, generates new attacks on Jews around the world today. Since October 7th, this is the type of anti-Semitism most likely to lead to Jews being murdered and synagogues being burned. It's not the only form, of course. Extreme right-wing anti-Semitism is still flourishing and deadly. American Jewry knows this only too well, and tragically so, following Pittsburgh and Poway. We cannot only look in one direction at once, but right now, the new reality for Jews around the world since October 7th is inextricably linked to this unique hatred of Israel. Now, for the fully committed, for the true believers who are determined to get rid of Israel completely, October 7th held out the hope that their dream was about to become a reality. Hamas swept into southern Israel with such ease, facing seemingly so little resistance that morning, that it felt like the beginning of the war to end Israel for good. Perhaps they held out hope that Iran and Hezbollah, bristling with thousands of missiles pointed at Israel, would deliver the coup de grace. This is why the protests back in those early days were so full of passionate excitement. It's why the anti-Semitism spread so quickly. They thought they were winning. But in the 21 months since then, this fervor has curdled. Israel has proven it is not going anywhere. Israelis have proven they are willing to fight, kill, and die for their country. Instead of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran joining forces to destroy Israel, instead Gaza lies in ruins with tens of thousands dead. And it is Hezbollah and Iran whose military threat to Israel has been exposed and degraded, their leaders either dead or humiliated in hiding. So in place of the anticipation that energized the Western solidarity movement on October 7th, there is instead frustration and anger. Protests aren't working, we are told, so they need to escalate. Just before Elias Rodriguez murdered Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky in Washington, D.C. in May, he posted online a political manifesto under the slogan, "Escalate for Gaza, bring the war home." That's the sentiment I'm talking about, and many in the pro-Palestinian world on both sides of the Atlantic have embraced and glorified Rodriguez and reposted his manifesto online since then. This is where this anger leads, to the murder of Jews in Western cities. If they can't get rid of Israel, they can at least try to make life intolerable for anyone in our own societies who is even tenuously connected to Israel, which inevitably means Jews get targeted. Now, it is telling that the political framing through which this campaign to eradicate Israel is currently waged is the language of decolonization. We are living in a period when there is much discussion about issues like structural racism and ideas of white supremacy, questions of colonialism and the legacy of Western conquest and domination. And there is a lot of debate about the role that these phenomena play in our societies and in our history. So perhaps it is no surprise that people try to force the history and the current reality of Israel and Palestine into that same political framing. Not a surprise, but it is a mistake. You can see why it would be seductive and satisfying to assume that the conflict in Israel and in Gaza is a legacy of Western colonialism and fits this familiar kind of frame, rather than doing the hard work of actually understanding its distinctive features and coming up with an analysis that fits the facts. Satisfying, but ultimately misleading. There are lots of reasons why it's wrong to treat Israel as just another example of Western colonialism, but I'm going to give you three. First is the fact that there was Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel at the time when Jews, or Judeans as they were, first became a people. And Israel is a place intimately connected to Jewish history, culture, and religion. This alone puts it in a different category to the vast areas of the globe that were conquered by European colonizers from the 15th century onwards. Second, and connected to this, there has been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel ever since, from antiquity to the present day. And this Jewish presence dwindled at times, for sure, but never ended. By the late 19th century, Jerusalem had a population that was majority Jewish. Jews have an unbroken connection to the land of Israel, therefore, in person as well as in spirit. And third, the Jewish masses who migrated to live in the land of Israel, whether this was when it was part of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, the British Mandate in the first half of the 20th, or the State of Israel ever since, were not sent to conquer or exploit or enslave for the benefit of their mother countries in Europe. They were refugees fleeing those countries and the anti-Semitic persecutions they experienced, whether that was in Russia, Poland, and Germany, or in Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, and Iran, or more recently in the Soviet Union, France, and Venezuela. Now, this difference is why there is a particular anti-Semitic thread woven into the fabric of this decolonization theory of the conflict, because of what it implies about Jewish history and Jewish identity. The idea that Israel is nothing more than an invention of modern European colonialism inevitably involves an effort to rewrite Jewish history, often with a straightforward denial that there ever was a Jewish connection to the land of Israel, either in ancient times or through to the modern period. The argument that Israel is a European implant in the Middle East implies that all Israelis are white Europeans, which erases the experiences of all the Mizrahi, Maghrebi, and African Jews who live there now. In short, it involves an imposition onto Jews of a false account of our own history and a restrictive, unwanted definition of Jewish identity, all deployed in support of a political campaign that most Jews would consider hostile or even dangerous. If you think about it, colonialism, racism, genocide, these are troubling and difficult aspects of the West's own history. They are the cause, for some people, of immense guilt, for other people, of very deep and difficult divisions. Now, Jews have always served a role as a useful scapegoat for sidestepping those kind of things in history. So perhaps it is not a coincidence that Israel today is treated as the symbol of all of the things that many people consider to be the West's most egregious sins. Jews have always been blamed for society's ills, held up as the exemplar of everything that is considered immoral or inhumane and unjust. In the Middle Ages, this meant Jews were thought to be literally satanic, blood-drinking demons in human form. In modern times, the right-wing myth of Judeo-communism and the left's imaginings about Jewish capitalism served the same purpose. This was not only about Jews being an unwanted minority, it was more profound, the idea that Jews are a representation of the evils that need to be purged to make the world pure. And that's why I find it so striking that today, Israel, the most visible global expression of Jewish life in the world, is treated by some as the absolute archetype of a human rights transgressor in a world in which human rights are the highest measure of moral good. Israel does things like any other country that are worthy of criticism, but Israel's actions alone do not explain why it gets this unique treatment, different from all other states and nations. This discrepancy, this unique standard applied to Israel, is a reflection of something much deeper. Just as Jews in history were at times feared and hated as a dangerous presence in society, representing all of humanity's worst and most harmful features, so today the same is applied by some to the Jewish state. There was even an article in The Guardian in May blaming Israel for climate change. Anything can be made to fit. And of course, because colonialism is seen not as a historical feature, but as an unforgivable moral sin, any product of colonialism, which in this thinking includes Zionism and the State of Israel, can never be accepted as legitimate. This is the logic that leads university professors to argue that any Israeli is a legitimate target for Palestinian resistance, even if they are peace campaigners living in kibbutzim on sovereign Israeli territory, as so many of the victims of October 7th were. If the old campaigns against the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza implied that Israel had a basic legitimacy within its pre-1967 borders, so the switch in the narrative and rhetoric of the anti-Israel movement from opposing occupation to arguing for decolonization implies that anything short of replacing Israel entirely with Palestine would be an injustice. After all, you cannot compromise with racism. And here in the diaspora, redefining Zionism as a form of racist colonialism means that anyone associated with Israel and Zionism is to be condemned without qualification, as if they lose all normal rights. If Zionism is the new Nazism, so this thinking goes, then Jews who refuse to denounce Israel, to separate themselves entirely from it, surely deserve to be excluded from normal society. This is the reality of how this political campaign manifests, whatever the intentions of the people making this argument. When my daughter's closest friend, who's studying at Birmingham University, saw a sign held up by her fellow students saying "Zionists off our campus," that's what she understood it to mean, whether they realized it or not. That any Jewish students who support Israel's existence, not its government or its policies, just its existence, ought to be forced off campus. This is the logical conclusion of the pro-Palestinian movement's drift towards this radical and absolute rejection of Israel's legitimacy. Now, there is some irony in this. Less than a century ago, European Jews were told they were not truly European, not truly white, and didn't belong in the nations they thought were their homes. So the Jews left Europe, those who survived at least, some in hope, but most forced to leave in fear. And they became refugees, many of whom made their new home and their own nation in the only place that had ever truly been a Jewish homeland. And now it turns out, we are told, that this was actually the greater crime. That far from being not white, Jews are now too white. Far from being not European, Jews are now nothing other than European. And rather than being refugees, they were in fact colonizers all along. It's a form of gaslighting, a classic inversion in which Jews are defined by others according to what matters to them, rather than what we Jews think of ourselves or what we actually are. It also, conveniently and rather satisfyingly for those involved, allows people to finally say what they want about the Jews 80 years after the Holocaust. A friend of mine back home in London recently challenged a group of people who were cutting down yellow ribbons that the local Jewish community had put up to remember the Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. My friend asked them why they were doing it, and even in an attempt to reach out to them, suggested they could put up pictures of Palestinians and Israelis side by side alongside the ribbons to promote peace. They laughed in her face. They called her, please excuse my language, a murdering bitch, told her she was complicit in genocide, and said Jews deserve to die. Not Zionists, not Israelis, Jews. No one wants to exist with Jews, they told her. You are all filth. Now, this was in a very nice, respectable neighborhood in London, one of those middle-class leafy suburbs best known for good schools and overpriced restaurants. But there's a permissibility now where people feel they no longer have to repress their anti-Semitism. Instead, they can say it out loud, and they can't be Nazis for doing so because now the Jews are the new Nazis. Increasing numbers of people, not just random strangers on the street, but high-profile public figures, feel able to say things about Jews that wouldn't have been out of place in Nazi Germany. And they can even do it to millions of people, whether via traditional media, social media, or a combination of the two. The rapper Kanye West, or Ye, has made it his mission to rehabilitate the swastika, starting with a halftime Super Bowl advert, and more recently by wearing it on clothing and jewelry in public. Andrew Tate repeatedly tweets that the Jews have tried to buy him off. Social media influencer Dan Bilzerian used an appearance on Piers Morgan's TV show recently to trot out the most disgraceful anti-Jewish myths and libels, such as the lie that the Talmud teaches that non-Jews are subhuman, that Jews believe they're allowed to steal from non-Jews, all sorts of grossly offensive claims about what Jews supposedly believe about Jesus. Piers Morgan was shocked by this and said he thought the interview would make Bilzerian look terrible. But Bilzerian knew better. He's pinned it to the top of his X account, where it has so far garnered 16 million views, because he knows there is a vast audience for anti-Semitism nowadays. Open, unadulterated Jew hate of the kind that used to be limited to neo-Nazi pamphlets and obscure web forums are now getting a hearing on respectable mainstream platforms and being algorithmically pushed into the consciousness of millions of people. This week, even Elmo, the beloved Sesame Street character, apparently tweeted "Kill all Jews" and got 100,000 likes for it before the studio took back control of the X account from whoever had apparently either hacked or hijacked it. Now, this anti-Semitism isn't a reaction to the conflict in Israel and Gaza. This is the old-fashioned kind. But the two merge together easily enough. And it creates a sense that everywhere you look, it is open season for anyone who wants to defame the Jewish people. And this is not only about individuals, it's also a problem of systems. Just like last week, X's in-house AI tool, Grok, itself began writing and posting neo-Nazi anti-Semitic content in response to users' questions, including that, quote, radical leftists spewing anti-white hate often have Ashkenazi Jewish surnames. It claimed that Israel was behind the 9/11 terror attacks and that Adolf Hitler would know how to deal with such people. It even renamed itself Hitler for a while. Now, X removed these posts and changed the algorithm, but for a few hours, Grok did the bidding of anti-Semites and neo-Nazis to endorse and spread heinous anti-Semitism to huge audiences. Now, all of these disturbing and dystopian trends came together at the Glastonbury Music Festival last month. For those of you who don't know, this is a music festival that takes place in England that is one of the biggest and most prestigious festivals in the world. The world's most famous bands perform over 4 days and dozens of stages. Around 200,000 people attend, and much of it is broadcast live on the BBC. It has become an iconic cultural event in Britain's summer calendar. And this year, one of the lesser-known acts, a punk rapper who nobody had heard of, who goes by the name of Bob Vylan, not his real name, just want to say, decided to grab the limelight. Now, a lot of the acts this year had displayed their support for the Palestinians, either by waving and wearing Palestinian flags or encouraging the crowd to shout Free Palestine. It's become the fashionable cause of the moment, a political identity in and of itself. And aligning with it is a way for artists to show that they are simultaneously both rebellious and completely conformist. But Bob Vylan decided to go one further, not only encouraging his audience, many thousands strong, to shout Free, Free Palestine, but successfully getting them to join him in a chant of death, death to the IDF over and over again. Now, the Glastonbury Festival, I should say, has always been known for the promotion of peace and togetherness. For many years, it raised money for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Greenpeace. And whatever you think of those causes, they are not usually advocates of encouraging death for anyone. But where Israelis are concerned, as we've said, different rules apply. At Glastonbury, you can call for death for the IDF, and the huge middle-class crowd, people who can afford a ticket and who think of themselves as decent and right-thinking, would join in. Where Israelis are concerned, it's not just okay to call for their death, it's positively welcomed. Now, it should go without saying, but a call for death is not a call for peace. It's not a call for a ceasefire. As part of the same set, Bob Vylan, this guy, also delivered a monologue to the crowd about how disgusting it was that he once had to work for an effing Zionist boss in the music industry. So I don't think we need to spend too much time wondering whether he's anti-Semitic. But what about the crowd? Why did they go along with it? Now, maybe they just weren't listening properly. Maybe they'd had a drink or two. If a concert audience is in the right mood, you can get them to sing along with anything, as Sacha Baron Cohen proved with Borat's infamous song, Throw the Jew Down the Well. But whether this case fits a technical definition of anti-Semitism or not is beside the point. This crowd were persuaded to join in a mass chant for death, and it spread immediately around the world. Heard in the storming of that restaurant in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, seen in anti-Israel graffiti and on T-shirts ever since. It is staggering and frightening how quickly a call for death can take hold, given the right circumstances. It's a reminder that in some sectors, murderous hatred is on the loose in our societies, in word and in deed, and it is directed at people like us. Now, when trying to decide whether something is anti-Semitic or not, we sometimes place too much weight on the exact analytical meaning of the words and forget to notice the sentiment, the emotion behind them. It's a strange thing to say from an academic perspective, but sometimes we analyze too much, and in the process we miss the wood for the trees. So we end up debating whether only hating Israelis really counts as anti-Semitism. We almost try and give the benefit of the doubt to people who only want to kill IDF soldiers, missing the fact that it is the word death at the start of the sentence that really matters. People discuss whether Elias Rodriguez knew that Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky worked at the Israeli embassy before he shot them, as if it would have made it any less of a crime. We make the mistake of over-rationalizing what is essentially an emotional phenomenon. Hatred is a destructive emotion, not a rational thought. In reality, and whatever the intentions of the people who make this argument, whether in university seminar rooms or at demonstrations, the idea that Israel is a uniquely illegitimate, racist, colonizing entity that should never have been created and that today acts with unmatched cruelty will never remain within the realm of political argument alone. It generates hostility towards Israelis as people based on their nationality alone, which easily then slops into hostility towards all Jews, Israeli or not. It is what leads to Israelis, and by extension, Jews, being shunned and boycotted, or even attacked and killed. That might not be the intention of the people making the argument, but in practice, we've seen it enough times to know this is just how it works. Now, it all leaves us asking the question, what can we do? Having described the problem, is there a solution? What can we do to try and fix this? We have to start, I think, by recognizing the reality of where we are. The 80-year anomaly since the Holocaust, in which anti-Semitism was a taboo that carried political and social costs for those who broke it, has gone. This has come as a tremendous shock to many in the Jewish world and beyond. Although it has not dropped out of a clear blue sky, the signs have been there for a while, the trend lines pointing in the wrong direction for several years. But many of us were lucky not to notice until it became impossible to avoid. And yet, this does not mean that catastrophe is inevitable. While being clear-eyed about the new dangers we face, it's important not to assume all is lost. Many in our Jewish communities have found a resilience and an inner strength since October 7th, a determination to stand up for our rights and our values. For everyone who has stopped wearing their Magen David necklace, there's someone else who's bought one for the first time. Perhaps they didn't feel the need to do this previously, but many have found this inner strength now, and we need to build on that. And more than that, there is a tradition and an ethos of campaigning and activism in our community that I fear we have lost sight of and that we need to reconnect with. Any of you who remember the Soviet Jewry campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s will know how entire Jewish communities and beyond mobilized to advocate for the rights of Soviet Jews, who were at that time one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, suffering terrible oppression under communist rule. That campaign was a tremendous success, not only in achieving its immediate goals of helping so many Soviet Jews escape persecution, but in energizing and activating our communities in the US, the UK, and many other countries. And that activist tradition and spirit is there in our recent history, and we would benefit from reviving it now. And most importantly, I think, it should be done with pride. The organisation in the UK I work for, Community Security Trust, we advise, we fund, we organise physical security across the UK Jewish community, and we've done this for decades because the terrorist threat to Jewish communities that we are all now tragically familiar with has been around for many years. In Europe, we've lived with it for a very long time. But importantly, we do this security work not because we are scared to be Jewish, but because we are proud to be Jewish. We are proud of our way of life, proud of the contribution that the Jewish community makes to wider society and to our nation as a whole, and we want to protect it. Because make no mistake, protecting Jews from anti-Semitism also at the same time protect society as a whole from terrorism, from extremism, and from hate. Most Jews in the world today live in democracies where the rule of law and protection for minorities are still fundamental parts of our political culture. We need to ensure this remains the case. A polity that would scapegoat and demonize one minority can do it to any minority. A society where hate and extremism are allowed to spread is one where ultimately nobody is safe. So just as tackling anti-Semitism is a task that benefits all of society, so it should involve all of society. And this is the part that we in the Jewish community often forget. We have many friends. Jews are not alone. There are so many people across society, I still very much believe the majority, who find anti-Jewish hatred abhorrent, who see it as an affront to their own sense of decency and their own values, and who are potential allies and partners in this struggle. We're not always good at finding them, but they are there. Perhaps many of you are here this evening. At a time when the fear and the reality of anti-Semitism puts pressure on Jews to turn inwards, we need to resist that pressure and look outwards, to build relationships based on dialogue, communication, and education, to reach out across communities so that people understand the impact that anti-Semitism has on Jewish people and the danger it poses for wider society. Finally, and perhaps most difficult of all, we need to find the self-confidence within ourselves to remain optimistic. There's a well-known and very old Jewish saying in Ethics of the Fathers that reads, "It is not your duty to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it." And this has always struck me as a fitting description of what it means to fight anti-Semitism. There may not be a silver bullet that can end this blight forever, a way to erase anti-Semitism from our world for good. But sitting on our hands and assuming all is lost is never an option. It might seem like an impossibly daunting task, but that is no reason not to try, and there is no time other than now to start. Thank you.